Silent Hill 2 is a very, very special game to a lot of people, and for very good reason. Silent Hill 2 speaks to people about the things they'd rather keep hidden, and lets them know that they aren't alone in the world. For some, they sympathise best with Angela, for others, Eddie. I've always been a main character kind of guy though, and James Sunderland, the lead of Silent Hill 2, has always had my attention for reasons I didn't really know until I myself was confronted with a diagnosis. James and his story has been seen through many different lenses. Some say that it's about depression, some say loneliness, and some even say it's plain about misogyny and how James is kind of a dick that broods over how bad of a guy he is. To me though, Silent Hill 2 is about DPDR, or Depersonalization Derealization Disorder. To best describe DPDR to you, you'll have to bear with me, because it's a really difficult thing to visualise. Imagine that you head over to the fridge and you realise you have to buy food. You get dressed and head out, maybe thinking up the list along the way, and when you finally get to the store, you somewhat awkwardly shuffle around the aisles, grabbing your items, paying for them, and going back home to eat. For every step of the journey, you are present. You take note of the cars on the road, the people you pass in the store, and even just the birds in the trees. You are here, in the moment, in your life. Imagine the same scenario, but you're looking through a veil, or a window of sorts. You feel your own body, and you're aware of everything that's happening around you, and that it is, in fact, happening. The only problem is, you can't connect your consciousness to it at all. It feels as if you're not really here, like you're inside a memory, even though you know you fully aren't. DPDR is when, how I like to describe it, you live in the back of your own head, in the back of your own life. The conscious becomes the subconscious, and your actions are driven by instinct, not active decision making. It impairs your ability to properly think and take in information on purpose because it doesn't trust that you won't be severely hurt if you are fully let out, so to speak. You're aware of the world around you, just not in it. It's a way for your brain to protect you from mental distress and harm. From my perspective, as someone who is recovering from an especially harsh bout with DPDR for the last 3 years, I really, and I mean really, resonate with James in Silent Hill 2. Let me explain why. Full spoilers ahead, I'm going in with the assumption that you have not only played Silent Hill 2, or the remake, but are aware of the many different endings the game has, and to some extent have analysed the contents there within. From the word go, we already know something is wrong with James, and so we'll use this as a starting point for our analysis, breaking down his behaviours when no one is looking, as that is how you can best identify traits of a disorder. He's staring at himself in the mirror, almost looking confused about who he's actually looking at. He touches his own face, trying to reconnect with himself in some way, before limply leaning back and shuffling out the bathroom, keeping eye contact with his reflection like a caged animal. He's severely distraught by something and can barely hold himself together. Without going into too much detail, only for cohesion's sake, James's behaviour is eerily familiar to how weeks of my life went, and considering what James did likely just hours before this scene, it's fair to me at least to assume that James, after killing Mary, has entered one of the two states of disassociation. The two main types of disassociation are depersonalization and derealization, hence the name. Depersonalization is the more common one, I believe, where you can't fully connect your life to the world around you. Derealization is much more severe, where you feel as if the world itself isn't really real. It's important to me that you don't come away from this video assuming that either of these is a form of schizophrenia, which is a mental illness that deserves respect in its own right. Disassociation is something that makes the world feel like it isn't real, but you're never put under any delusion that it isn't actually real. It's an important distinction. Anyway, I believe James suffers from the latter of the two, the realization, because the next thing he does, once he leaves the bathroom and finds himself at his and Mary's special place, most likely having driven there subconsciously based off of pure instinct after putting Mary's body in the backseat of his car, is create a narrative. He can't take what he's done, he doesn't want to accept it, and so, to avoid the truth, James creates a new one. Mary was diagnosed with what most fans believe was a type of skin cancer 3 years before the events of the game. I believe that after 3 years of stress caused by dealing with Mary's deteriorating mental condition and the cancer, both financially and emotionally, James had a mental collapse one day, and decided to end both of their suffering, potentially after Mary told James that she just wanted it all to end. Blaming the cancer, the starting point for his pain, he uses it to construct a story in his head, that Mary had died 3 years ago, and that he had mysteriously gotten a letter telling him to return to their special place. This would help to ease his guilty conscience and suppress the pain that he no doubt feels after killing Mary, and would also allow him to engage in activities that distract from the painful thoughts in his head, both of which are clear examples of DPDR. You might be wondering how that aligns with DPDR. I mean, if James is deluding himself with fake scenarios to ease his own guilt, then surely there must be something more going on mentally. Because I just said that DPDR doesn't make you hallucinate. Well, one of the more uncommonly talked about traits of DPDR is fantasizing. When your surface level thoughts are so heavily suppressed, it doesn't mean that all brain function ceases entirely, and sometimes sufferers will find ways to entertain themselves unknowingly while in disassociative episodes. The most consistent form of entertainment is simply making things up, like having a fake relationship or being a superhero. James isn't genuinely believing anything he's saying or thinking, and he acknowledges that in many ways throughout the game, both consciously and subconsciously, but he is especially hesitant to get back to the real world in comparison to most, because most DPDR sufferers fall into disassociation out of their own control, while James is likely looking for an escape. The best example I have for James confronting himself on his purposeful encouragement of DPDR is with Pyramid Head. James himself says that he needed punishment for what he did, and the existence of Pyramid Head in the first place is a confirmation that James does acknowledge what he's done, he just isn't willing to admit it yet. I would like to stress here that I'm not trying to excuse James's behaviour and the murder of his own wife by using mental illness as a shield. I empathise with James and understand why he thinks and acts the way he does, because for a long time I acted and thought in somewhat similar ways, but that never made me violent or antagonistic, it just made me weird. James's actions are ultimately his own, based off of his own personality, and even with how much pain James was undoubtedly going through during Mary's last years, he is nowhere near off the hook for what he did. Also, it's possible James may have developed a lighter form of DPDR once Mary's diagnosis finally happened, with the potential of it getting more severe as things got worse, but there's no way to know for sure. Sometimes DPDR can creep in to help cope with hard times in life, and other times it appears quickly, like it did with me. As we exit the beginning area, this video is going to derail a little and become more symbolic. Not just to save us both time on me over-explaining and over-elaborating on every single time James displays a behaviour or symptom associated with DPDR, but also to help examine more elements of DPDR represented in Silent Hill 2. This video is about James and showing my reasoning as to why the game, in my opinion, is speaking about his likely DPDR. To do that, all I need is music, art direction, and social interactions. What immediately jumps out as the game begins is how silent it actually is. There's no grand rock orchestra to lead us into the game. We walk down a muddy, foggy forest trail and listen to an almost hissing music track. Silent Hill 2 is well known for its amazing music, and to me, the music of Silent Hill 2 is perhaps its most intentional expression of DPDR. The music consistently follows one philosophy, and that is the hiss. Almost every song in Silent Hill 2, both original and remake, has an underlying hiss, a collection of long-winded notes that drone in the background of songs, without causing discomfort, but unsettling your listening experience. The intention, I believe, is to put you alongside James, and allow you to experience how crowded his thoughts are. There's an underlying truth James knows is there, subconsciously, but is actively being repressed by his DPDR. When I was in the worst of my DPDR, I distinctly remember brief moments of clarity I would have, where I felt like myself, and in those moments there was no hissing. I was clear of the thrashing waves, there wasn't any turbulence, I was just there, in the moment. The only times the music takes breaks from the hissing is during songs like Beneath the Null Moon, which you'll notice is a song that plays in a scene which is very focus heavy for James. But even then, during the scene when he begins to relax, a hissing begins to re-emerge in the song. When James actually does have to focus on the world around him, the hiss subsides a little and he can breathe, which I choose to interpret as his brain allowing him to think clearly without any interruption, even if only for a brief moment. The songs immediately following these focus tracks are normally played when he's interacting with other characters, are swarmed with the hiss. And again, I feel that's on purpose. James has dealt with whatever situation absolutely demanded his attention, but now he's at risk of thinking about Mary and what he did, so the hiss comes back and his DPDR kicks in again in full force. Another note about DPDR here, but it's not something you can feel without intense focus, and even then, you're mostly noticing its absence. You don't notice you're disassociating most of the time, you're just living in the back of your head, idly watching as life goes on by, knowing something is wrong psychologically, but not really getting the full picture. Beating DPDR isn't about stopping it from happening actively, it's about focusing on your life intentionally so it doesn't wash away. Beating it takes trying to beat it, fighting to live in the moment, fighting to have control over your conscious thought, and not being controlled by instincts. Anyway, If you would like some good tracks to help give you examples of the hiss in Silent Hill 2's music, I recommend White Noise and After Daddy. The point of the music is to never let up, never let you have a rest from what James is confronting in Silent Hill. At least not until it's over. Although it is interesting that the hissing only gets worse as James fights bosses and enemies, potentially a representation of how he processes the fights. These fights are bound to cause him even more mental distress, seeing as every enemy in Silent Hill is deeply symbolic design-wise, so the extra hissing could be a way to show that his brain is trying to drown out every thought so that he can just deal with the demons and get this all over with. Just some fun speculation. Aside from the music, the second thing to jump out at us as we enter Silent Hill is the strong visual language being used. Silent Hill 2 is an exploration of James and a suppression of his own thoughts, rather than his ownership of them and his actions that caused them in the first place. The foggy streets of Silent Hill are a staple of the town in general, and while to some that might just stand out as a piece of design iconography from the franchise, I can't help but note how Silent Hill 2 transforms the fog into something with far more intent behind its inclusion. It's a literal interpretation of James's disassociation, an actual fog that surrounds him, rather than a symbolic window or veil. Aside from that though, the town itself is entirely empty. The only other real people here are all visitors that don't actually live in Silent Hill. The houses and shops are all freshly abandoned, having not been left for more than a few months. There's a distinct feeling of isolation to it all, which I feel represents how DPDR can feel as you navigate the real world. You feel closed off, only the important stuff matters, like the buildings and streets. You may expect me to talk about the other world and the monsters now, but not really. Silent Hill 2 is about more than DPDR, and even though I feel that James absolutely suffers from it, and a lot of the game should be viewed through that viewpoint, it doesn't mean that literally everything is about DPDR. James killed his wife, has an overly active libido, and feels dirty on the inside for everything, so the monsters are weirdly sexy in a very dehumanizing way to put emphasis on how disgusting James is for not being able to control his hormones around his dying wife and lusting over anything that breathes. And also the general filth represents the filth that he feels on the inside. His entire world is rusted and infected, almost as if the man himself is in some way corrosive on the inside. The art direction in Silent Hill 2 is designed to make you feel like you're melding with the world. James disappears into buildings, the fog engulfs cars in the distance. It feels like every aspect of the world is being lost to this all-consuming homogeny that James can't escape, at least not until he gets to the other world. It's a phenomenal representation of how confusing and isolating DPDR can be, like the world around you is swallowing you, but not as a threatening, gaping maw. Instead, you fear simply vanishing, unable to fight against the all-consuming fog as you wander aimlessly, going from place to place with no clear direction outside of the mirages in your head that keep you sedated and travelling along a safe path. As we move away from art, we can finally make our way to Angela, and we get to see the best and only example I'm going to need of how DPDR can affect the way you socialise, and what I mean by your conscious becomes the subconscious. The only reason why I'm going to break down this social interaction specifically is because not only is this the way most of you will interact with someone with DPDR, that being in short bursts, but it'd also be an exercise in all of our patience to push it past one conversation analysis. If you want though, the cinema scene with Eddie is a great example of some of the tendencies I'm going to bring up here in association with how DPDR can make you behave, and it highlights some of the examples that this scene doesn't show, like a clear lack of deeper thought behind words, which can lead to misunderstandings, which is fairly common within people with DPDR. Angela is a character racked by trauma, paranoia, and mental regression tendencies when faced with hardships. Naturally, she's not the easiest person to converse with, but most people can pick up on her sudden fright and her apologising for James scaring her as something to be sensitive towards. She needs a softer hand, a calmer voice, and patience. Now, what makes this scene special is that James does pick up on her personality, and does somewhat abide by the interaction standards I outlined, but he can only hold on to them so long as they serve him, and that's what really sends my assumption of DPDR home. Remember, DPDR wants to stop you from really thinking about much of anything outside of pure survival, which leads to the disconnect between mind and the world around. So as people with DPDR interact with the world, they often treat it with a fairly selfish fashion, in ways that strictly serve basic emotional needs and physical needs. As the conversation begins, he's speaking soft, standing at a distance with his hands to his side, and giving Angela all the time in the world. However, once he gets his answer of where Silent Hill is from Angela, he intends to end the conversation. Not rudely, he isn't intending to be antagonistic, He simply got what he needs, and his brain currently isn't wired for anything more complex than his current goal. When Angela tries to warn him about the dangers of Silent Hill, the tone in his voice completely changes, and notably drops an octave too. He's not trying to be threatening, he just doesn't see the point in appeasing her emotional needs because now he has what he needs. It's why he is somewhat curt in what he says. "I'm going either way" is an oddly arguable way to speak to someone who is trying to help you, but when you consider his likely mental condition, it makes a lot more sense. He does become a little softer when pushed on why he intends to go anyway, when he has to bring up Mary in the narrative he created, but that ends when Angela brings up her own desire to be in Silent Hill. James can only half-heartedly wish her luck on her journey of finding her mother. He isn't trying to be mean, and he does wish the best for her. He just can't afford the mental bandwidth to care about another person outside of purely "I hope you don't die" kind of scenario. This attitude is carried in every interaction he has through the entire rest of the game, with the only time James seemingly really cares about someone is the mirror scene with Angela, where he gets the knife from her, and the scenes with Eddie in prison. Note that in these scenes, the other person is in a horribly fragile mental space, and James tries to disarm or dissuade them from violent tendencies. This is most likely due to caring more about his own survival than their mental stability, which isn't the worst thing in the world until you realise that James had the chance to save Angela and Eddie, but was too busy disassociating out of his fucking mind to even consider that Eddie might need an ear and some comfort, and Angela might need someone to trust and protect her. They were far from hopeless cases when he found them, but he fumbled them when they needed him, and that may have sealed their fate. James is a man with his own problems, but many of them are created by himself. Through an unwillingness to change and grow, to accept his sins and stay focused in reality, James slips into a deep derealization episode that gets 2 people killed, not counting Maria, because her status as person is kind of up for debate. In conclusion, I feel everything from the music design to the art design to the character interactions are very strongly designed with disassociation in mind, even if that wasn't the actual authorial intent. I can't help but see myself in James, even if I've never done anything close to what James did. I see many of my past tendencies and behaviours, and even some that are still around to my chagrin, and so I want to see James overcome the worst parts of himself and reconnect to life in front of him, and pay the price for his crime. James is a deeply lost and confused man, but that loss and confusion comes from his own hand, which he could have prevented had he been a better person in the past. Silent Hill 2 asks a lot of its players, and one of the biggest questions is if James deserves redemption. I seem to think so, but I also can't help but feel disgusted by James at the same time. He's a confusing character for me, who simultaneously represents my mental condition in one of the best manners ever, but he's also a wife killer. Silent Hill 2 is a masterpiece. This is your reminder to replay it, and I hope you all have a lovely day.